Okay, hello everybody. Uh, this is Adrian Bardon. I'd like to say, first of all, thanks so much to Giuliano for organizing this conference. He's been working very, very hard and deserves our gratitude. I greatly regret not being able to be there in person today, but I showed up for my airplane and it turns out my passport was not satisfactory and that didn't work out. I feel like as an American, I deserve special treatment, but that's not the case. Um, this session today arises out of a book project I and my colleagues are working on, where we're trying to look at what we can learn about cognition and perception through the study of temporal illusions. Coming soon, we hope, to a bookstore near you. We regret also that Argyro Vatakis couldn't be with us today. It turns out she was not able to travel here, but we hope she can join us the next time around. I hope I can join you the next time around too. So, my job today is to examine the question, is the passage of time an illusion, and can we address this question experimentally? So, here's some quotes from a variety of theorists on time who seem to have identified the experience of flow with an experience of the passage of time itself. So there's really two claims here. Number one, that there is an experience of flow, and number two, that is the same as having an experience of the passage of time somehow, or at least it's tied up with a direct experience of the passage of time. So you're no doubt familiar with this kind of claim, and these theorists as well. Now, illusions are often categorized as physiological or cognitive. Perceptual illusions really involve multiple systems, and this discrimination is kind of rough, but this is a common way of categorizing illusions. So we have physiological illusions, after images, phantom limb syndrome. You might say those are stimulus-driven illusions, or primarily stimulus-driven. Cognitive illusions involve some kind of unconscious expectation or processing heuristic that leads you to misinterpret certain kinds of situations. You have your ambiguous figures, um, distortion illusions, the moon illusion, Mueller-Lyer. And then the most important type for purposes of this discussion is perceptual completion, also known as perceptual filling in. A very famous example is what happens with the visual blind spot. Then there's the temporal blind spot, which has to do with the filling in of the saccadic period as your eyes are flicking around. Some of you may or may not know about that one. That's a really awesome one. Then some other standard examples of perceptual completion are the kinesia triangle and phi movement. But for purposes of illustration, here's your kinesia triangle. So perceptual completion is a kind of automatic constructive inference where certain features of your environment wind up being perceived even though they're either not present or not available to perception. So here it's difficult. Most people looking at this, it's really difficult not to perceive a white triangle floating in the front of this, above this, the rest of the elements in this illustration. So the visual system, just somehow decides, well, there's enough evidence of a triangle here. Now, obviously, this kind of heuristic will be helpful in innumerable real-life cases of incomplete or missing information. Indeed, situations involving incomplete information are more the rule than the exception. So this kind of heuristic kind of has to be in place. Now, this is also true of visual processing with regard to movement. So let's look at perceptual completion in the case of phi movement, or also known as the phi phenomenon. Now, most folks who are fixating on the center of the circle, and especially if you close one eye, will wind up seeing a blue circle moving continuously around the perimeter here. Okay. Now that we've seen what perceptual completion refers to, let's look at a partial typology of views on the alleged perception of the movement of time itself. Here's some suggestions. So number one, there's a sensation of the passage of time, and it is a veridical sensation. So some A theorists, as we've already seen, appear to fall in this category. Now, as for number two, it's not. I'm not sure if anybody actually does fall in this category, and if anyone can think of somebody, I'd be happy to hear about it. However, there does seem to be a certain conceptual space for number two here, that the sensation of the passage of time is a physiological illusion. So I'm just including that for the sake of completeness. Now, of course, the correct answer is number three, is that there is no sensation of the passage of time, even an illusory one. Our notion of the passage of time is the result of a kind of projection of the psychological consequences of having different experiences, memories, and anticipations at different times in a block universe. This Bardon et al. Calls veridicalism, which you don't want to confuse that with number one. So that's not, number one is not veridicalism. We're gonna call number three veridicalism, it looks like. So this involves the notion of projection, as in famously as in Hume, where we confusedly think that we perceive viciousness when we witness a scene of willful murder, even though there's really no sense impression corresponding to viciousness at all. Really, there is only the emotion of dismay upon thinking about a disposition to harm others. Now, so this is a view that I've endorsed in the past, that I've denied that there's an illusion. There's either a sensation of the passage of time or an illusory sensation of the passage of time. I'm going to talk about a different view for the sake of argument right now, but until someone shows me this cannot account for the data, I still regard this as the most parsimonious assessment of the situation. So finally, we have illusionism, which is that the perception of the passage of time is the result of a cognitive illusion. Often, for illusionists, this has something to do with phi motion or beta motion or something like that. And the Bardon et al. Called this illusionism. We're going to stick with that term. So that's Paul 2010 is the modern, locus classicus for this view. I don't know who would be historically considered the originator of this view. Also implicated here would be Lepedevin and Prosser, at least according to some interpretations. All right, so let's right away bring up the most important objection to illusionism. I think that, well, arguably the most important objection, which is that it's just not clear what the connection is between motion and phenomenology and passage phenomenology. As Chris Hurl has said, I'll quote here, if we can give an account of what the illusion in the case of the phi phenomenon amounts to, that is couched entirely in the vocabulary of the reductionist, the sense in which apparent motion, and by extension experience of real motion and change, is also supposed to involve an additional illusory phenomenology of passages left unexplained. So we can already give an account of the illusion of motion, or the phi phenomenon, entirely in B-theoretic terms. So what more do we need? Haven't we thus explained everything we need to explain? So the question under consideration today is, what can we say on behalf of the illusionist here? And I'm going to examine a recent proposal as to how we could experimentally look at this question. For that, consider the following. This is the wagon wheel illusion. And as I hope you can see, at a certain speed where the wheel is spinning around, the spokes appear to stop, or reverse motion. According to a prevailing interpretation of this illusion, our visual system is not continuous but discrete. That is to say, it is sampling inputs every few milliseconds, maybe somewhere between 10 and 20 cycles per second, and generating an apparently continuous scene through perceptual completion. According to this interpretation, our visual system thus has a kind of frame rate, much like a motion picture camera, which under this circumstance, when the motion of the wheel matches up just right with this quote-unquote frame rate, it syncs up with the inputs in such a way as to produce this effect. This is not the only interpretation of the wagon wheel illusion. It is contentious, but it is a prominent contender, namely that this is perceptual completion based on a discrete visual system organizing itself into something that looks more continuous. Further, there is a not insignificant body of evidence that our experience of the world is less a matter of a continuous signal than a discrete sequence of events, based on cortical oscillation. This is thought by some to be the brain's solution to the binding problem, or the issue of how the discrete bits of our experience become a unified picture of the world. If this holds up, it may have implications for illusionism, and maybe even for an experimental test thereof. Now, Gruber, Smith, and Bloch, on the premise that A, conscious awareness as a whole is discrete rather than continuous, they hypothesize that B, that the experience of flow, sometimes associated with an experience of passage, is the result of multimodal perceptual completion applied to our rapid multimodal perceptual sampling of reality. Now, there's a much remarked upon difference between seeing a process unfolding versus judging that a process has taken place. The classic example of this is the second hand versus the minute hand. You see the second hand sweeping along, but with regard to the minute hand, you simply look at it at different times and you judge that a change has taken place. This difference is clearly determined in part by frequency of availability, that is to say, length of interval between stimuli. Now, let's look at the phi phenomenon again. So the top box has a change happening with a relatively long interval between the appearances of the lines. So what you see here is two lines which are kind of taking turns, appearing one after the other. Whereas the bottom line, where there's a short interval between appearances, one is struck by the illusion that there's only one line there and it's just moving around. It's all happy, changing color, very busy little line moving around there. And some people would even see here a kind of ghost image of the line in between its appearances. And that's the real phi phenomenon right there. Now, this interval dependency is demonstrable for different sensory modalities. As Gruber and Bloch have demonstrated, this includes auditory, as in the sound of a bomb dropping, but there's if it's interrupted, but the interval is very small, like it's perceived as a single process, and as opposed to distinct sounds that have nothing to do with each other. Same thing for the tactile effects, like the sensation of something crawling up your arm. A length of interval has also been implicated in perception of object permanence and apparent causation, the relationship between two perceived events. The shorter the interval, the more likely you think that one causes the other. This is pretty obvious, but when you think about it, you realize that interval does a lot of work. So, in connection with this, now consider the following very recent discovery about brain function: the claustrum. Francis Crick was studying this area of the brain for decades and thought it played a central role in the organization and dissemination of information to the rest of the brain. So this Kubasi and colleagues were operating on a woman with severe epilepsy just a couple years back, and they were putting electrodes into different parts of her brain to kind of see where the problem was stemming from. And when they put an electrode into the claustrum region and turned it on, she instantly lost consciousness. And they turned it off again, and she essentially instantly regained consciousness. So this got them really excited, so they started turning her off and on, and they did this 10 times apparently, and took note of that the fact that they seemed to be turning her consciousness on and off, and this was interesting to them. I don't know how I would feel if I was the patient under these circumstances, but well, there it is. There's the data. All right, this effect has not been replicated, except of course with the same patient. But let's suppose, just for fun, that this effect can be replicated. Gruber et al. Suggest an experiment exploiting this effect. Hey, let's make conscious experience gappy across all sensory modalities at once by switching consciousness on and off. They predict that a long enough interval between moments of consciousness will result in a loss of a sense of passage due to loss of a sense of flow. The idea is that this would show that perception of passage is a perceptual completion type cognitive illusion analogous to, and perhaps including, apparent motion illusions, thus experimentally confirming illusionism. Now, the exact relationship between the hypothesized effect and phi motion remains a bit vague, which is a problem I will address in a moment. Indeed, this proposal makes a number of assumptions, and now here's some possible objections. Okay, number one, like Rip Van Winkle, what if the subject wakes up without any notion of a discontinuity? That would seem to subvert the entire point of the test. On the other hand, reports of subjects suffering from anterograde amnesia indicate there's a sort of subconscious awareness of elapsed time, despite not having any episodic memory pertaining to events during that period. So this is an empirical question. I don't think we will really know what will happen in terms of the subject's experience until we do it. I think that there might be some hope here, and we would just have to test it out and see what happens. Now, the next objection, the second objection here, is really the most serious one and harkens back to the main objection to illusionism. Why would this do more than just explain the experience of continuity as opposed to the experience of passage, as Natalia has recently noted? I think that Hurl has something similar in mind when he says that the difference between experiences of change and judgments that change has occurred, which we all agree is partly dependent on sampling frequency and interval, explains not the illusion of passage, but simply the mistaken belief that there is an illusory sense of passage. I remain unconvinced that the illusionist has the right explanandum here. Isn't the simplest story going to involve, well, how do we explain the mistaken belief that there's a sense of passage, as opposed to, how do we account for the sense of passage, which turns out to be an illusion? So, can the illusionist make some kind of hypothetical connection between motion phenomenology and passage phenomenology, and by extension, this connection between the experience of continuity and the experience of passage? Well, maybe you could argue that there are perceptual and non-perceptual factors that, taken together, amount to an illusory experience of passage related to our experience of continuity and via perceptual completion. I'm not going to try to spell out how this argument would go, but I could kind of see how somebody might try to make the case for this. There's one more objection, which is practical rather than philosophical, which is the problem, as this might have occurred to you, is that this claustrum stimulation procedure requires inserting electrodes deep into the brain. And so I'm really not sure how, in practical terms, we're going to execute this experiment outside of North Korea or something like that. But it's interesting to think about anyway. Now, finally, before I conclude, While illusionism is not the way I would go at this time, although I think it's worth discussing. Let me return for a second to the issue of whether our apparently continuous conscious perception is the result of cyclical multimodal sampling, which would make our experience of the world fundamentally discrete rather than continuous. This seems to me like an empirical question of great relevance to the philosophy of time. As far as the study of our awareness of time is concerned, it seems like for astronomy, not knowing whether the Earth orbits the Sun or vice versa. So this is an area where I think that philosophers should be looking, one of many areas where I think philosophers should be looking carefully at relevant empirical work. And that concludes my presentation. Over to Sean and Valtteri. Thank you very much.